If she stopped moving, she would die. And Clara Whitmore knew it with a clarity so sharp it cut deeper than the cold. The wind tearing across the Wyoming plains like a living thing, screaming through her ears, dragging at her thin dress until the fabric snapped against her skin, her bare feet sinking into snow that climbed past her ankles, each step slower than the last, each breath burning, shallow, desperate. The world around her nothing but white and shadow and the distant memory of warmth. She could no longer reach. She stumbled, caught herself, kept going. Because stopping meant sleep, and sleep meant never waking again. And somewhere behind the storm, somewhere beyond the howling dark, she felt it, the weight of something unseen, not chasing, not hunting, just there, steady, watching, the kind of presence that made the back of her neck prickle even through the numbness. She turned her head, squinting through the swirling snow, but saw nothing except the endless drift and the ghost of her own breath. Then her knee buckled, sudden, unforgiving, and she went down hard into the snow, the impact knocking the air from her lungs, cold rushing in to take its place. She tried to push herself up, her fingers digging into ice that did not yield, her body trembling uncontrollably now, not from fear, but from the last thin edge of strength slipping away. "No," she whispered, though the wind swallowed the word before it could exist, her vision blurring, the world dimming at the edges. And that was when the storm shifted, not in sound, not in force, but in something deeper, a break in the chaos, a shape forming where there had been nothing, tall, unmoving, impossibly solid against the violence of the wind. She blinked, once, twice, certain it was a trick of her failing senses, but the figure stepped forward, boots crunching through snow with a weight that felt real, grounded, undeniable. And suddenly he was there, close enough that she could see the outline of broad shoulders beneath a heavy coat, the shadow of a hat pulled low, the faint glint of eyes that did not waver, did not hesitate. A man carved from the same harsh land that was trying to claim her. He did not speak at first, did not rush, just stood there as if measuring the moment, as if deciding something that mattered. And then he moved, fast enough to steal what little breath she had left, one strong arm sliding beneath her shoulders, the other lifting her legs, pulling her from the snow as though she weighed nothing at all. Her head fell against his chest, and for the first time in hours, she felt something that was not cold, heat, solid, controlled, dangerous in a way that made her pulse stutter even through exhaustion. She tried to pull away, a weak instinct more than a decision. But his grip tightened just enough to stop her, not hurting, never hurting, just holding, steady, unyielding. "Stay still," he said, his voice low, rough, cutting through the storm like something meant to be obeyed. And though fear flickered, sharp and instinctive, something else followed it, something she did not understand, something that made her fingers clutch weakly at his coat instead of pushing him away. And as he turned, carrying her deeper into the storm instead of out of it, she realized she had no idea whether she had just been saved or stepped into something far more dangerous. The cabin door slammed shut behind them with a heavy crack, wood striking wood, and for a moment the storm still roared just inches away, clawing at the walls, slipping through every gap in the logs like it refused to let her go. Then it dulled, muffled, reduced to a distant howl that pressed against the structure instead of tearing through it. And the sudden shift felt unreal, like stepping out of one world into another. But the cold followed her inside, clinging to her skin, sinking deeper, refusing to release its hold. He did not set her down right away, not even as the dim glow of firelight revealed the narrow space. Rough timber walls, a small iron stove burning low, shadows stretching long and uneven across the floor. His arms remained firm around her, steady, controlled, as if he knew exactly how fragile she was in that moment, and exactly how much pressure she could take before breaking. Clara forced her eyes open, blinking against the heat that stung almost as much as the cold had. Her breath came out uneven, visible in faint white clouds, and for the first time she truly saw him, not just a silhouette in the storm, but a man, tall, broad, his coat dusted with snow that was already melting into dark patches, his jaw lined with rough stubble, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that did not invite questions, only obedience. He lowered her onto a worn wooden chair near the stove, slow, deliberate, as if even that simple motion required precision. The moment his arms left her, the absence was immediate, sharp, and unwelcome. She did not understand why, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else. Her fingers curled weakly at her sides, searching for balance, for control, for something to hold on to. He stepped back just one pace, no more, creating a narrow space between them that felt both necessary and charged. His eyes moved over her quickly, not lingering, not invasive, but thorough, assessing, taking in the torn fabric, the trembling hands, the way her shoulders hunched against a cold that had not yet left her bones. "You are freezing," he said, his voice low and even, not a question, not concern dressed in softness, just fact. And before she could respond, he reached for the kettle hanging over the fire, the movement smooth, practiced, the kind that came from repetition, from a life built on routine and control. Clara swallowed, her throat dry, raw. She should have spoken, should have demanded answers, asked where she was, who he was, what he wanted, but the words tangled somewhere between fear and exhaustion, and instead she watched him, watched the way his hands moved, steady despite the storm still raging outside, watched the way he kept just enough distance to be safe, but never enough to feel absent, and that balance, that careful control, unsettled her more than any threat could have. The cabin creaked softly as the wind pressed against it. The fire snapped, a brief burst of sparks rising into the air, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching, thick, filled with something unspoken, something that hovered between caution and something far more dangerous. Clara shifted slightly in the chair, her body protesting the movement, and his gaze snapped back to her instantly, sharp, alert, as if he had been waiting for it. "Do not move too fast," he said, stepping closer again, not touching, not yet, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, steady, grounding, and without thinking, without deciding. She found herself holding still, not because she was told, but because part of her no longer wanted to risk losing that warmth, and that frightened her more than the storm ever could, because somewhere beneath the cold, beneath the exhaustion, something else had begun to wake, something that made her wonder if staying here might be just as dangerous as going back out into the night, and she had no idea which one would cost her more. The fire cracked louder, sharper, as if the cabin itself felt the tension tightening between them, and Clara's fingers curled against the edge of the chair, knuckles pale, her body still trembling, but no longer only from the cold, because now there was something else, something coiled beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze, and for a second it held, steady, unflinching, his eyes unreadable but not distant, never distant, always present in a way that pressed in close without touching. "I did not ask to be brought here," she said, her voice rough but steady, forcing strength into words that threatened to shake, the kind of strength that had kept her alive this long, alone, unwanted, pushed to the edges of a world that did not make room for women like her. And yet, even as she spoke, her body leaned ever so slightly toward the warmth he carried. A betrayal she could not control. He did not react immediately, did not step back, did not step closer, just watched her, weighing something again, always measuring, always deciding. "You would not have made it another 10 minutes out there," he replied, calm, certain, not cruel, just truth laid bare without softness. And that truth landed hard, heavier than the wind that still battered the cabin walls. Clara's jaw tightened, because she knew it was right, and knowing made it worse, made the choice that followed feel less like freedom and more like surrender. She pushed herself to stand, slow, unsteady, the room tilting for half a second before settling, and instantly he moved, not fast, not forceful, but enough, one hand hovering near her arm, not grabbing, not yet, just there, ready, and that restraint, that precise control, made her pulse quicken in a way she did not understand. "I can leave," she said, though the words sounded thinner than she intended. The storm outside answering with a low, relentless howl that seemed to wait for her, to claim her the moment she stepped beyond that door. His gaze flicked briefly toward it, then back to her, sharper now, something darker beneath the surface, not anger, not exactly, but something protective that carried its own weight. "You can," he said, And he did not stop her, did not argue, did not reach out. And that was worse than if he had. Because suddenly the decision sat entirely in her hands. Heavy. Final. The kind that could not be undone. Clara took one step toward the door, her legs weak but moving. The cold already creeping back into her bones just from the thought of it. Her breath catching, her chest tightening. She imagined the snow swallowing her again. The silence that followed. The end of it all. And then she felt it. Not a touch. Not yet. But the presence behind her, closer now, his heat at her back, his shadow stretching over her feet. "If you walk out," he said quietly, his voice lower than before, closer, controlled in a way that made every word land heavier. "You do not come back." The statement hung between them. Not a threat, not a command, just a boundary drawn with absolute certainty. Clara's hand hovered inches from the door latch, her fingers trembling, caught between pride and survival, between fear of him and fear of losing the only place that had not rejected her. And in that moment, she realized something she had not wanted to see, that the most dangerous part was not the storm outside, but the fact that a part of her did not want to leave him at all, and she did not yet know why. The wind found a way through the cabin walls, thin and sharp, slipping between the logs with a low whistle that rose and fell like a warning, and the fire answered with a restless flicker, light bending, shadows shifting across Ethan's face until his expression seemed to change with every breath. Clara's hand hovered at the door for 1 second longer. Then slowly, deliberately, she let it fall, not in surrender, not yet, but in calculation. In something colder than fear, she turned to face him. Fully, her back still close enough to the door to feel the draft creeping through the wood. Her chin lifting despite the tremor in her body. "I stay," she said, each word measured, controlled. But not like this. The silence that followed pressed in tight, heavier than the storm outside. Ethan did not move, but something in him shifted, subtle, almost invisible, his weight settling differently, his attention narrowing, as if her words had drawn a line he had not expected her to draw. "Explain," he said, low, steady, and the single word carried more weight than a dozen questions. Clara took a breath, slow, uneven, forcing her thoughts into order, because if she did not take control now, she would lose it completely, to him, to the cold, to whatever this place was becoming. "I am not your responsibility," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, even as her fingers tightened against the fabric of her dress, grounding herself. "And I am not staying here to be told when to move, or how to breathe." The fire cracked again, loud, sudden, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's gaze did not leave her, not once, and that unwavering focus made the space between them feel smaller than it was, charged, alive. She expected him to push back, to remind her of the storm, of her weakness, of the fact that without him she would already be gone. But he did not. Instead, he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, closing the distance by a single step that felt like far more, and then he stopped, just within reach, close enough that she could see the fine lines of weather on his skin, the way his breath moved steady and controlled while hers still came uneven. "You are in my cabin," he said quietly, not harsh, not raised, but absolute, the kind of certainty that did not need force to be understood. Clara's pulse jumped, but she did not look away, could not afford to. "Then I decide if I stay," she answered, the words leaving her before doubt could catch them. And there it was, the shift, subtle but undeniable. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, something sharper, something that almost resembled respect, or challenge, or both. The wind outside slammed harder against the walls, the entire structure groaning in response. And without warning, the door rattled violently behind her, the latch shaking, the cold air pushing through stronger now, the storm reminding them both what waited beyond that thin barrier. Clara flinched, just slightly, and that was all it took. Ethan's hand moved, fast but controlled, bracing against the door beside her, not touching her, but close enough that his arm caged the space, his body blocking the draft, the cold easing instantly, replaced by the solid warmth of him. The contrast hit her like a shock, and for a second she forgot what she had been saying, forgot the line she had drawn, because now the distance between them was almost nothing, his presence filling the air, steady, grounded, dangerous in a way that felt nothing like the storm. You decide, he said, his voice lower now, closer, each word deliberate. But you follow my rules while you are here. Clara's breath caught, not from fear alone this time, but from the weight of what he was offering and what it would mean to accept it. Her eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, to the space between them, to the narrow gap that no longer felt safe or neutral, then lifted again, meeting his gaze with something new behind it, something steadier, more certain. Then I have one condition, she said, her voice quieter now, but firmer than before, and the moment the words left her, the tension in the room shifted again, because for the first time, she was not just deciding whether to stay, she was deciding what staying would cost both of them. Her condition did not come out as a demand, not sharp, not loud, but it landed heavier than anything she had said before, because it carried something deeper than defiance. It carried truth. You do not touch me unless I say so, Clara said, her voice steady even as her breath trembled between them, and for a moment the fire seemed to dim, the air tightening around the words. Ethan did not move, not a single inch. His hand still braced against the door beside her, his body still close enough to shield her from the cold that slipped through the cracks. But his eyes changed, just slightly, something flickering beneath the control he held so carefully. Not anger, not offense, something more complicated, something that recognized exactly what she was asking for, and exactly what it would cost him to agree. The wind struck the cabin again, harder this time, the wood groaning low, and instinctively Clara's shoulders tensed, her body betraying her again, leaning toward the only warmth in reach, toward him, and she hated that, hated how quickly survival blurred the line she had tried to draw. If I break that, he said after a long moment, his voice quieter now, slower, as if each word was being weighed before it was allowed to exist, you walk out. Clara blinked, caught off guard, because she had expected resistance, expected control to tighten, not to be handed something that felt dangerously close to power. Even in this storm, she asked, her voice barely above the sound of the fire. And this time he did move, just enough to tilt his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. Especially in this storm, he answered, and there it was, the shift, real and undeniable, the balance between them changing in a way neither of them could fully take back. Clara swallowed, her throat tight, because she understood now that this was not a game of control alone. This was something else, something that required trust she did not have, and yet the warmth pressed against her back, the steady presence of him, the quiet certainty in his voice, it all worked against her, slowly, persistently, like the fire thawing frozen ground. She nodded once, small but final, and in response Ethan stepped back, not abruptly, not retreating, but giving her space in a way that felt deliberate, respectful, and somehow more dangerous than when he had been close. Because now the distance existed by choice, not by force. Clara exhaled, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and for a moment the cabin felt different, quieter, the tension shifting into something softer, but no less intense. She moved toward the fire on her own this time, slow, careful, lowering herself onto the chair again, the heat reaching her skin more fully now, seeping into her bones, her hands lifting toward the flames, fingers still shaking, and without thinking she spoke. I have nowhere else. The words slipped out, unguarded, and the moment they existed she wished she could pull them back, because they revealed too much, too quickly, the truth she had been holding behind every word, every stance, every line she had drawn. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, not with conflict, but with something closer to understanding. Ethan did not respond right away, but when he did, his voice had changed, just slightly. The edge softened, the control still there but no longer cold. Then you stay, he said, simple, certain, as if it had already been decided long before she stepped through his door. Clara's chest tightened, not from fear, not this time, but from the weight of what that meant, because staying was no longer just survival. It was something else, something that pulled her deeper into a space she did not understand. And as she looked up at him again, really looked, she realized that leaving might have been easier than what she had just chosen, and she had no idea if she would be strong enough to face what came next. The storm did not pass. It tightened, pressing against the cabin with a deeper force that made the walls groan and the floor shift beneath their feet. The kind of cold that did not just bite the skin, but settled into bone, slow and relentless. Clara felt it even by the fire, a chill that refused to fully leave. As if the storm had followed her inside and claimed a place within her, she drew her arms closer, fingers curling into the worn fabric at her sleeves, watching the flames fight to stay. Alive, smaller now, weaker than before, and that was when she noticed it, the woodpile by the stove, not empty, but not enough, not nearly enough. Her gaze flicked to Ethan, who was already looking at it, already calculating, always one step ahead of what survival demanded. The silence between them shifted again, no longer just tension, but awareness, shared, unavoidable. How long? She asked, her voice quieter now, stripped of defiance, shaped by something closer to reality. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes moving from the fire to the door, then back to her, measuring time against distance, against risk, against the storm that showed no sign of breaking. Not through the night, he said finally, and the words landed harder than anything before, because they carried no argument, no room for denial, just truth. Clara's breath caught, her chest tightening as the weight of her choice settled fully. Staying had not removed the danger, it had only changed its shape. She looked back at the fire, at the shrinking flames that now felt like a countdown, each flicker marking time slipping away, and without thinking she stood again, slower this time, steadier, her body adjusting, adapting. Then we get more, she said, the words coming before doubt could stop them. Ethan's gaze snapped to her, sharper now, something unreadable passing through it, not surprise, not approval, something closer to recognition, but he did not agree, not yet. Instead, he stepped toward her, closing the distance again, not invading, not forcing, but present, in a way that demanded she understand what she was suggesting. You step outside now, he said, low, controlled. You do not make it 10 yards. Clara held his gaze, forcing herself not to look away, even as her pulse quickened, even as the memory of the cold clawed back into her mind. And if we stay, she countered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, we freeze anyway. The words hung there, sharp, undeniable, the kind that could not be softened or ignored, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the fire crackling weakly behind them, the wind howling louder, as if it had heard their decision and was waiting to see which way they would break. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the air between them, and then something shifted, subtle but real, his posture changing, the weight of decision settling into him. We do it together, he said, and the words were not a suggestion, not a compromise, but a statement of fact. Clara's heart stuttered at that, not just at the risk, but at the implication that she was no longer just someone passing through his space, but part of the choice itself. She nodded once, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and without another word he turned, reaching for his coat, movements precise, efficient, every action grounded in survival. He crossed back to her, holding out a heavier jacket, his hand steady, waiting, not forcing. Clara hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of what she was about to do, then stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body again, close enough that the space between them disappeared without either of them naming it. She took the coat, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, and the contact was enough to send a sharp awareness through her, not fear. Not exactly. Something else, something she pushed down before it could take shape. Ethan opened the door, and the storm surged in immediately, violent, unforgiving, the cold hitting her like a physical force that stole her breath in an instant. She faltered, just one step, and his hand moved again, not grabbing, not pulling, but bracing at her back, firm, steady, anchoring her against the chaos. Stay close, he said, his voice cutting through the wind. And this time she did not argue, did not resist, because the world outside offered no illusions of control, only survival. And as they stepped out into the storm together, the door slamming shut behind them, Clara realized too late that the tracks already waiting in the snow did not belong to either of them. The wind hit like a wall the moment they stepped outside, thick with ice and force, stealing the air from Clara's lungs before she could even breathe. her body folding instinctively toward Ethan, not by choice but by need, his hand tightening at her back just enough to keep her upright, steady, unyielding against the storm that seemed determined to tear them apart. The world beyond the cabin was no longer land or sky, only chaos. White and endless, swallowing distance, swallowing direction, and then she saw it again. The tracks, half buried but unmistakable, not theirs, not fresh, but not old enough to be forgotten, leading away from the cabin, then circling back, and something in her chest tightened, sharp and immediate. Someone was here, she said, her voice barely cutting through the wind. Ethan did not answer, but she felt the shift in him, subtle, controlled, his body turning just slightly, positioning himself between her and the direction the tracks led, not blocking her, not forcing, but protecting in a way that felt instinctive, automatic, and that made the air between them change again, because this was no longer just about cold or survival. This was something else, something unknown, something that had already touched this place before she arrived. The storm surged harder, the wind driving snow into her face, stinging, blinding. She stumbled, just one step, and his hand came firmer this time, not gentle, not hesitant, pulling her closer, his chest at her shoulder, his breath warm against the side of her neck for a fleeting second before it vanished into the cold. "We go back," he said, and this time there was no room for argument, not in his voice, not in the way his body moved, guiding her, turning her, anchoring her against the force that pushed from every side. Clara hesitated, her eyes dragging back to the tracks, to the shape they made in the snow, circling, waiting, and for a brief, dangerous second, curiosity flared stronger than fear, because leaving meant not knowing, meant staying in a place that might not be as safe as it felt. But then the wind howled louder, the cold biting deeper, and she felt it again, that pull toward him, toward the only solid thing in a world that was slipping away. She stepped closer without thinking, closing the distance herself this time, and his reaction was immediate, his hand shifting slightly, not to hold tighter, but to adjust, to keep her balanced as they moved. The cabin door loomed through the storm, barely visible, a dark shape against the white, and reaching it felt like crossing a line between life and something else. Ethan pushed it open, the wind forcing its way inside with them, the fire nearly guttering under the sudden blast, and then the door slammed shut again, cutting the storm off like a knife, silence falling heavy, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing. Clara stood there for a second, her body still braced for the storm that no longer touched her, her chest rising and falling too fast, too shallow, and then she turned, fast, driven by something she could not name, her eyes locking onto his, searching, questioning, demanding. "You knew," she said, not loud, but certain, because the way he had moved, the way he had reacted, it had not been surprise, it had been recognition, and the space between them vanished in that moment, not physically, but in something deeper, something that pulled tight and refused to release. Ethan did not look away, did not deny it, his jaw tightening just enough to confirm what she already felt, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, something darker beneath the control. "They do not come this far unless they are desperate," he said, and the words settled into the room like a second storm, heavier, quieter, and far more dangerous. Clara's breath caught again, not from the cold this time, but from the realization that whatever had left those tracks might not be gone at all, and that the cabin they had just fought to return to might already be the place it was waiting for them. The door held, but only barely, the wood still trembling from the force of the storm outside, and inside the cabin the air shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if the silence itself had weight now. The fire burned lower, its light softer, unsteady, casting long shadows that stretched and pulled across the walls. Clara stood where she had turned to face him, her chest rising slower now, her breath no longer sharp, but still uneven. And yet something had changed, something that could not be undone, because she had seen it in him, that flicker of knowing, that hint of a world beyond this cabin that he had not shared. And now she could not unsee it, could not pretend this was only about cold and survival. Ethan moved first, but not toward her, not this time. He stepped past her instead, crossing the small space to the stove, crouching to adjust the fire, adding one of the last pieces of wood with careful precision, as if even that small act required thought, control, restraint. Clara watched him, her eyes tracing the movement, the way his shoulders carried tension even when he appeared calm, the way his hands never hesitated, and yet never rushed, and the distance between them, though only a few feet, felt wider now, filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. She wrapped her arms around herself, not from the cold this time, but from something deeper, a quiet fracture in the sense of safety she had begun to feel. You knew they were close. She said again, softer now, less accusation, more realization. Ethan did not look at her right away, his gaze fixed on the fire as if it held the answer, or perhaps as if it was easier than meeting her eyes. I knew they might be, he said finally, his voice low, measured, and that word, might, lingered in the air longer than it should have, because it was not certainty, not protection, it was risk, and she had walked straight into it. Clara swallowed, her throat tight, her mind racing through everything that had led her here, the storm, the cold, the moment she chose to stay, and now this, a place that was not empty, not safe, not simple, and yet she did not move toward the door, did not step away, because something held her there just as strongly as fear once had, something quieter, harder to name. Ethan stood again, turning slightly, and for a brief second their eyes met, and in that look there was no distance at all, only awareness, sharp and undeniable, of how close they had come, of how much they were already tied to each other by choices neither of them could take back. Then the moment broke, subtle but real, Clara's gaze dropping first, her fingers tightening against her sleeves, and the shift in power settled into something more complex. No longer just control and resistance, but something shared, something uncertain. The fire snapped softly, a brief flare of light that illuminated the room just long enough to show how small it truly was, how little space there was between them, and how impossible it would be to ignore each other now. The wind outside eased slightly, not stopping, never stopping, but changing tone, lower, steadier, like a breath drawn in before something else. And then it came, not loud, not forceful, just a sound, faint, deliberate, from somewhere beyond the cabin walls. Not the wind, not the shifting of snow, something else, something that moved with intention. Clara's head lifted instantly, her eyes snapping toward the door, her body going still in a way that had nothing to do with choice. And across the room, Ethan had already turned, already listening, his entire posture shifting into something sharper, more alert, the silence inside the cabin tightening again, thick, suffocating, as the sound came once more, closer now, just on the other side of the wall, and then nothing, no wind, no movement, only a waiting stillness that felt far more dangerous than the storm ever had. The sound did not come again, and somehow that made it worse, the silence stretching thin and sharp, pressing against Clara's ears until even her own breath felt too loud, too exposed. She did not move, not at first, but her eyes shifted, not to the door this time, but to Ethan, and what she saw there stopped something inside her, because he was not surprised, not uncertain. He was waiting, every line of his body drawn tight with control, with readiness, with something that had been there long before she arrived. And suddenly the balance shifted, subtle but undeniable, because she realized he had not been reacting to danger, he had been expecting it. They are not lost travelers, she said, her voice low, steady, cutting through the silence in a way that forced him to respond. And for a moment he did not, his gaze holding hers, measuring, deciding again, always deciding, but this time the choice felt heavier, more personal. No, he answered, and the single word landed differently now. Not just information, but admission. Clara took a step forward, not away, not retreating, but closing the space between them on her own terms, her fear still there, sharp and real, but no longer the only thing guiding her. Then why are they here? She pressed, and something in her tone changed, not pleading, not dependent, but demanding. And for the first time since she had entered that cabin, she was not just reacting to him. She was pushing back. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze flicking once toward the wall where the sound had come from, then back to her. And in that brief hesitation she saw it, the fracture in his control, the piece of truth he had not intended to show. Because of me, he said finally, and the air shifted again, heavier, colder than before. Clara's breath caught, but she did not step back, did not retreat into the fear that rose instinctively. Instead, she held her ground, her eyes narrowing slightly as something else surfaced, something buried beneath the exhaustion, beneath the cold, something she had carried long before she found his cabin. "Then they are not the only ones looking," she said quietly. And this time it was Ethan who stilled, not moving, not speaking, but listening in a way that felt different, sharper. Clara reached slowly toward the inside of her dress, not sudden, not threatening, but deliberate, and for a fraction of a second his body shifted, instinct pulling him forward, ready to stop her if needed. But he did not. He held himself back, control winning over reaction, and that restraint hung between them as heavily as anything else. She pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, folded tight, edges softened from being handled too many times, and held it up just enough for him to see. "They are not after you," she said, her voice steady now, almost calm, and that calm carried more weight than fear ever had. "They are following this." Ethan's gaze dropped to the paper, then lifted back to her face, slower this time, deeper, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the storm, beyond the woman he had pulled from the snow, and into something far more complicated, far more dangerous. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer empty. It was full, thick with realization, with the shifting of everything that had been assumed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried something new, something darker, something that hinted at a past she had not yet seen. "Then you brought them to my door." And the words did not accuse, did not blame, but they changed everything, because now the danger outside was no longer his alone, and no longer hers. It was something shared, something neither of them could walk away from. And for the first time since the storm began, Clara realized that staying here might not have been a mistake. It might have been inevitable. The storm surged again, louder than before, as if the world itself had closed in around the cabin, the walls creaking under pressure, the fire shrinking to a restless glow that barely held the dark back. And between them the air tightened, charged with something neither of them could ignore any longer. Clara's hand still held the folded paper, but it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a weight pulling everything toward a single point, a choice that could not be undone. Ethan stepped closer, not slow this time, not cautious, but deliberate, closing the space until there was nothing left between them but breath and heat and the thin edge of restraint. His eyes locked onto hers, not searching now, not questioning, but holding, as if he needed her to understand exactly what stood in front of her. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low, steady, but something beneath it had shifted, something sharper, something that carried more than control. It carried the weight of consequence. Clara did not look away, even as her pulse rose, even as the storm outside seemed to echo inside her chest. "And you should have told me they would come," she answered, her voice just as firm, just as unyielding. And for a second the tension snapped tight, balanced on a line that could break either way, neither of them stepping back, neither of them giving ground. The fire cracked suddenly, a burst of light flashing across his face, revealing something she had not seen before, not just strength, not just control, but something held back, something restrained with effort, something that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with her. And that realization hit harder than the cold ever had, because it meant this was no longer just survival. It was something binding them together in a way that neither of them had chosen. "If they find this place," he said, his voice quieter now, closer, the words meant only for her. "They do not leave empty." Clara's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the paper, the truth settling into her with a weight she could not escape. She had brought the danger, and now she had to decide what to do. With it, she could leave, step back into the storm, draw them away, give him back the isolation he had before she arrived, or she could stay, face whatever was coming, and accept that there was no clear line between protection and risk anymore. The choice pressed against her chest, heavy, immediate, unavoidable. She stepped closer instead of back, closing the last inch between them, her breath uneven but steady enough to hold his gaze. "Then we do not let them find it," she said, and the words felt like crossing something final, something that could not be undone. Ethan did not move, but the shift in him was unmistakable. The decision landing, locking into place, not just his, but theirs, shared now whether they wanted it or not. Outside, the wind howled louder, the sound rising until it felt like the entire world was holding its breath, waiting, and inside the cabin the silence between them thickened, charged with everything that had not yet happened, everything that would follow. From this moment, his hand lifted slightly, not touching her, stopping just short, as if even now he held himself back, and that restraint, that control, made the space between them feel even tighter, more dangerous than any contact could have been. Clara's heart pounded, her thoughts narrowing to a single point, a single realization that burned through the fear, through the cold, through everything else. She was not leaving. Not now. Not like this. And the moment she understood that, everything changed, because staying meant choosing him, choosing this place, choosing whatever came next. And as the storm roared and the fire flickered low, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more weight than anything before. Then you stay close. And the way he said it made it clear, this was not a suggestion, not a request. It was the line between what came before and what was about to begin. And just as Clara drew her next breath to answer, something struck the outer wall of the cabin, hard enough to shake the entire structure, and the choice she had just made suddenly felt far too late to take back. The impact against the wall did not come again, and somehow that silence was louder than the storm had ever been, stretching thin through the cabin as the fire burned low and steady, no longer fighting, just surviving. And outside, the wind began to ease, not stopping, but softening into something distant, something that no longer pressed against the door like it wanted in. Clara stood where she had chosen to stay, her breath slower now, deeper, her body no longer braced for the next blow, and across from her Ethan had not moved far, but something in him had shifted, the sharp edge of readiness easing into something quieter, something held but no longer locked tight. They listened, both of them, not just for danger, but for what came after it. And what came was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, only the slow settling of snow against wood and the faint creak of a structure that had endured. Clara's grip on the folded paper loosened, not dropped, not forgotten, but no longer clenched. Like a weapon, and for the first time since she had pulled it from her dress, it felt less like a burden and more like a choice she had already made. She lifted her eyes to him again, and this time she did not search for answers. She did not demand. She simply looked, and in that look something passed between them that did not need words, an understanding shaped by everything that had happened and everything that had not. Ethan took a slow breath, visible in the cool air, and stepped closer, not with urgency, not with control, but with intention, stopping just within reach, close enough that the warmth between them felt shared rather than taken. His hand lifted again, the same motion as before, the same pause just short of contact. But this time the space between his fingers and her arm felt different, not restraint, not distance, but invitation. Clara did not step back, did not hesitate. She closed that final inch herself, her arm brushing lightly against his hand, and the contact was small, almost nothing, but it carried more weight than anything before, because it was chosen freely, without fear pressing it forward. His hand settled then, steady, grounding, not holding, not claiming, just there, and the tension that had filled the room shifted into something quieter, deeper, something that did not need to prove itself. The fire flickered, casting a soft glow over them, and for a moment the world outside felt far away, reduced to a memory of cold and noise that no longer reached inside these walls. Clara exhaled slowly, the sound soft but certain, and with it something inside her settled, not fully, not completely, but enough to stand without bracing, enough to meet his gaze without searching for danger. I am still here, she said, the words simple, but carrying everything they meant, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, not in command, but in recognition, as if he understood that staying had become something more than survival, something neither of them had expected. And as the first faint light of morning began to bleed through the edges of the window, pale and cold but steady, Clara realized that the storm had not only changed the world outside, it had changed something inside her that would not return to what it had been before. And in that quiet, in that fragile warmth. She understood that sometimes the most dangerous choice was not stepping into the storm, but choosing to remain where you could finally be seen. Morning came slowly, not with warmth, not with relief, but with a pale, fragile light that slipped through the narrow window and stretched across the cabin floor in thin, uneven lines. The storm had passed, but it had not left, not entirely. The cold still lingered in the wood, in the air, in the quiet that followed something too large to be forgotten. Clara stood near the window now, her fingers resting lightly against the rough frame, not gripping, not bracing, just touching, as if confirming that it was still there, that she was still here. Outside, the world lay buried under a thick blanket of snow, smooth and untouched, as if nothing had ever crossed it, as if no tracks had circled the cabin in the dark. And that absence felt heavier than any sign of danger could have, because it meant whatever had come had chosen to leave, or worse, to wait. Behind her the fire burned low but steady, no longer struggling, its warmth quiet and constant, and Ethan moved within that space with the same controlled ease. But something in him had shifted. The sharp vigilance softened into something watchful but not closed, aware but not distant. He set another piece of wood onto the fire, not urgently, not because he had to, but because it was needed, and the smallness of that action carried more meaning now. Clara turned slightly, her gaze finding him without effort, without hesitation, and when their eyes met, it was different, not a test, not a challenge, but a recognition, something that had formed between them in the hours that no longer needed to be named. She stepped away from the window slowly, the movement unguarded. Crossing the short distance toward the table where the folded paper still rested, she picked it up again. But this time her grip was light, almost thoughtful, as if she was seeing it for what it truly was, not a secret to protect, not a burden to carry alone, but a choice that had already shaped everything. Ethan watched her, not questioning, not interrupting, simply present, and that presence no longer pressed against her. It steadied her. Clara looked down at the paper for a moment longer, then folded it once more, slower this time, deliberate, before setting it aside, not hiding it, not offering it, just letting it exist between them. And that act, small as it was, shifted something final, something quiet but absolute, because it meant she was no longer holding herself apart from him, no longer guarding against what might happen if she stayed. She had already stayed. She had already chosen. The cabin felt different now, not larger, not safer, but more real. Every creak of wood, every flicker of light grounded in something they both shared, something built not from certainty, but from what they had faced and what they had not turned away from. Ethan stepped closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough that the space between them felt intentional, balanced, his gaze steady, not searching, not demanding. And when he spoke, his voice carried no edge, no command, only truth. "It will not be quiet for long." Clara nodded slightly, not in fear, not in doubt, but in understanding, because whatever had begun was not finished, and the calm that filled the cabin now was not an ending. It was a pause, a breath before something else. She met his eyes again, holding them this time, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And in that moment the tension that remained was no longer something to resist. It was something to carry, something that tied her to this place, to him, in a way that could not be undone. And as the light grew stronger and the shadows faded into the corners, Clara realized that the storm had not taken everything. It had left something behind, something quieter, deeper, something that would follow them both long after the snow outside began to melt, and neither of them stepped away. The land opened wide beneath a sky painted in slow-burning gold, the storm long gone but not forgotten, its memory held in the softened edges of snow that melted into dark earth and stretched across the prairie in quiet surrender. Clara stood just outside the cabin, her boots firm on ground that no longer shifted beneath her, the air still cold but no longer biting, the wind gentler now, brushing past her instead of pushing her back. And for the first time since she had stepped into that storm, she did not feel like she was fighting to remain where she stood. She simply was. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, untouched, vast, and yet no longer empty, because something had changed, not in the land, but in her. Behind her the cabin door creaked softly as it opened, and she did not need to turn to know it was him. She felt it in the stillness that followed, in the way the air shifted just enough to carry his presence without overwhelming hers. Ethan stepped out, his movements the same as they had always been, steady, controlled, grounded, but there was no distance in him now, no barrier held between what he was and what he allowed her to see. He came to stand beside her, not too close, not too far, the space between them no longer a question, but a choice made and understood. Clara let her gaze drift across the land once more, the fading light catching in her eyes, reflecting something softer, something settled. And then she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "I could leave." The words were not heavy this time, not filled with fear or doubt, just truth spoken into open space. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the same horizon, as if he understood the weight behind what she had said without needing to hear more. "You could," he replied, calm, steady, without tension, without expectation, and that was what made it real, because there was nothing in his voice that tried to hold her, nothing that demanded she stay, and yet the silence that followed did not pull her away. It held her there. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath visible for a moment before fading into the evening air, and then she turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him, not searching, not questioning, but seeing him fully for what he was, not just the man who had pulled her from the storm, not just the one who had stood between her and the cold, but the one who had never taken more than she chose to give, and that realization settled deeper than anything else. "But I am not going to," she said, and this time the words carried no hesitation, no edge, just certainty. Ethan's gaze shifted then, meeting hers, and for a brief moment the world seemed to narrow to that single point, that single understanding, and he nodded once, not in approval, not in relief, but in acceptance of something that had already been decided long before either of them spoke it. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the scent of thawing earth and something new beneath it, something that had not existed before the storm had come and passed. Clara turned back to the horizon, her posture relaxed, her hands no longer clenched, and beside her Ethan remained, not watching over her, not standing apart, but there, steady, present, a part of the space she had chosen rather than the force that had brought her to it. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the land and merged into one, Clara understood something simple and unshakable, that survival had brought her to his door, but it was choice that made her stay, and sometimes the place you fight the hardest to escape is the one that finally becomes your home.